The night was still, the kind of eerie silence that sits heavy before something terrible happens. The small suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek had always been picture perfect: rows of neatly trimmed lawns, pastel-painted houses, and the ever-watchful eyes of the homeowners association. For newcomers like Ryan and his pregnant wife, Emily, it seemed like the perfect place to start a family. He had served his country for 12 years as a Navy SEAL, yearning for peace. She, a nurse, carried a gentleness that balanced his hardened edges. Together they were ready to build a quiet life. But peace doesn't sit well with everyone, especially not with Karen Whitmore, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. To her, control was oxygen. Every flower planted, every car parked, every fence painted, all of it had to pass her invisible test. Ryan's presence, quiet yet unshakably strong, unsettled her. She could sense something she couldn't dominate. And that frightened her more than she'd admit. It began with small things: anonymous notes about unapproved garden plants, warnings taped to their mailbox about improper waste bins. Then came the fines, arbitrary, relentless, and ridiculous. Emily would laugh them off, telling Ryan not to take it personally. But he could see the pattern. He'd been trained to recognize escalation long before it exploded. He tried diplomacy at first, believing in restraint, in keeping the peace for Emily's sake. But Karen thrived on pushing buttons. Her authority within the HOA made her untouchable. Her husband, a local fire inspector, only fueled her arrogance. Together they had created a fortress of power, one built on fear, manipulation, and carefully crafted lies. That night the storm clouds rolled in. The air was humid, thick with tension. Ryan had left for a late-night grocery run. Emily, 7 months pregnant, stayed home. She'd been painting the nursery, a soft yellow glow under warm light. She sent him a picture just before he got to the store, her message reading, "Can't wait for you to see this tomorrow." It was the last message he would ever receive from her. Minutes later he heard the sirens. A column of black smoke rose in the distance, its reflection flickering across the windshield like the gates of hell opening. He knew instantly. He didn't need the address, his instincts screamed it. The drive back was a blur, the roar of the engine barely louder than his own heartbeat. When he arrived, the house was gone, swallowed by fire. Flames reached into the sky, devouring the life they had built. Neighbors stood helplessly, whispering, pointing. Some were crying, others filmed. The fire truck stood parked like metal beasts, lights flashing red across the wreckage. A firefighter held him back when he tried to rush in, shouting something about safety and oxygen levels. He barely heard him. All he saw was Emily's car in the driveway. All he could smell was burning wood and paint, and something worse. Hours later, when the fire was finally out, the officials called it an accident. Faulty wiring, they said, a tragedy, nothing more. But Ryan's training told him otherwise. He noticed the gas can lying half-melted near the porch. The smell of accelerant was unmistakable to someone who had seen explosions for a living. And then he saw her, Karen, standing across the street in her robe, sipping from a mug. Watching, her eyes met his for only a second, but in that second he saw everything: guilt, arrogance, and the cold satisfaction of someone who believed she had just erased a problem. She turned away before the officers noticed, but Ryan didn't. He watched her walk back into her house, unbothered, untouched, as if nothing had happened. The investigation closed within days. No charges, no questions. Karen's husband filed the report himself, stamping it electrical fault and burying the evidence under HOA bureaucracy. Neighbors moved on quickly, as people in pretty neighborhoods always do. Ryan buried Emily and their unborn child beneath a willow tree outside the city limits. No ceremony, no visitors, just him, the earth, and a silence that echoed louder than any scream. He left the military years ago to find peace, but as he stood at that grave, something in him shifted. The calm that once steadied him in battle turned to ice. The soldier within, the one he had tried to bury, began to wake. He remembered every covert operation, every night spent in hostile territory, every time he'd watched men burn for less than what had been done to his wife. Ryan didn't cry. He didn't rage. He planned, he watched, he moved with precision. The same discipline that made him one of the deadliest operators alive now turned toward a single mission: justice. But this wasn't military terrain. This was suburbia, where power hid behind smiles and paperwork. He knew he couldn't attack head-on, not yet. He spent weeks gathering evidence. Photos, HOA meeting notes, surveillance footage, even drone shots of Karen's property. Piece by piece he began to uncover her corruption: embezzled HOA funds, bribes, and years of abuse against homeowners who opposed her. She had weaponized authority, and no one had ever pushed back. Until now. By the time the first snow touched the charred remains of his home, Ryan was no longer just a grieving husband. He was something colder, sharper, a man with nothing left to lose. The same man who once operated deep behind enemy lines was now preparing for a new kind of war. And this time the battlefield was his own neighborhood. The storm wasn't coming. It had already arrived. The weeks following the fire were a blur of polite condolences and silent avoidance. Neighbors who once waved now crossed the street. The HOA replaced Ryan's burned lot sign with a pending review notice, as if his home and family were just another violation on their list. The police closed their file before the ashes cooled, but Ryan hadn't forgotten, and he wasn't done. He started small, almost invisible, a quiet shadow moving through the routine calm of Willow Creek. By day he appeared broken, distant, the grieving widower too lost to fight back. By night he became something else entirely. His military instincts took over: observation, infiltration, analysis. Every motion, every habit, every secret of the neighborhood became data. He was mapping an enemy territory disguised as suburbia. His first clue came from the fire report, a single phrase written by Karen's husband, Robert Whitmore. Accidental ignition due to faulty insulation. Ryan had seen enough fires in combat zones to know how electrical burns looked. He knew this wasn't one. The pattern of destruction, the burn marks near the porch, and the way the flames had spread all pointed to deliberate ignition. Someone had poured accelerant near the baseboards, and Ryan had found traces of it on the charred grass himself. He started gathering proof the way only a seal could, silently. Precisely without a trace. He hacked into the HOA's private digital archive, stored conveniently in a local server protected by nothing more than a generic password. Inside were years of documents, minutes of meetings, fines, complaints, even private messages between board members. He scrolled through hours of data until he found what he needed: multiple reports of noncompliance logged against his address, each one signed by Karen personally long before the fire. But one document froze him. A letter from Karen to the HOA's insurance partner sent just 3 days before the blaze. It mentioned a potential code violation and requested an emergency safety inspection of his property, one that never took place. Instead, the inspection log showed Robert marking it as cleared. The timing was too perfect. It wasn't negligence, it was coordination. That night, Ryan sat alone in his temporary apartment, staring at the flickering glow of the computer screen. His hands were steady, but inside him something boiled, a quiet, dangerous certainty. He wasn't fighting just a corrupt neighbor. He was facing a system built on arrogance and greed, protected by fake smiles and forged signatures. He began documenting everything. Every night he surveilled the HOA office, capturing license plates, times, and faces. He installed a discreet motion camera near the charred remains of his house, catching anyone who dared to visit. Karen came twice. Each time she lingered, whispering into her phone, packing like someone checking on a problem she couldn't quite bury. Ryan's training told him to watch, not strike, but patience became a weapon. He studied Karen's patterns: when she left for her morning walks, the time she spent at the community pool, her weekly wine nights where gossip flowed freely. She controlled the entire board through fear and favors, manipulating votes, silencing dissent, and rewarding loyalty. But even in her arrogance, she left traces: whispers of bribes, falsified contracts, inflated maintenance budgets. The deeper Ryan dug, the darker the trail became. He found homeowners who had mysteriously sold their houses after conflicts with the HOA, all at below-market prices. The buyers, shell companies linked to Robert's real estate firm. It was a cycle of intimidation and acquisition, all hidden beneath the HOA's polished community reports. One night, Ryan broke into the HOA's storage unit. Inside were boxes of shredded documents, outdated files, and discarded correspondence. Among them, a crumpled envelope marked with soot, his address printed on the front. Inside was a letter never mailed, signed by Karen. Final warning: your continued noncompliance will result in escalation. Failure to cooperate leaves us no choice but to enforce neighborhood policy. Enforce! The word echoed in his mind like a gunshot. Now he knew. The fire hadn't been an act of rage, it was policy, it was punishment, and it was personal. But he couldn't go to the authorities yet, not without undeniable evidence, not while Robert still had control over the local fire department's records. So Ryan began his second phase: exposure. He reached out to other victims carefully, through anonymous emails and encrypted calls. He found 3 families who had lost their homes under suspicious circumstances. 2 had moved states. 1 refused to speak, too afraid of what they might do. Each story carried the same threads: HOA threats, unannounced inspections, and fires declared accidental. He also discovered something else: a security camera feed from a neighbor across the street. The footage showed a faint silhouette the night of the fire, a person near the porch moments before the flames erupted. The quality was poor, but the shape of the coat, the gait, the height, they matched Karen. Ryan felt the weight of every second since that night pressing down on him. Every mission he had survived before felt distant compared to this. This wasn't about orders or duty. This was personal retribution, justice for Emily and their unborn child. He started leaving breadcrumbs. Anonymous complaints, anonymous leaks, whispered rumors in HOA meetings, small things that made Karen nervous. He wanted her paranoid, restless, questioning her own safety the way she had stolen his. He was preparing her for the downfall she never saw coming. But even as he worked in silence, he noticed eyes watching him too. A black SUV parked too long outside his apartment. Unfamiliar faces at the local cafe. His instincts screamed surveillance. Karen had sensed something, and she was tightening her grip. The game was turning both ways now. Still, Ryan didn't break. If anything, the tension sharpened him. He was close, too close to back down. All he needed was one undeniable link between Karen, Robert, and the fire. Something irrefutable, something that even the most corrupt official couldn't bury. And he found it in the form of a single insurance claim dated 2 days before the fire. Karen's husband had filed it in his company's records, claiming structural damages to their home caused by neighbors' electrical faults. It was the final piece. They had staged the fire as a cover-up, turning Ryan's tragedy into profit. As the truth crystallized before him, Ryan knew the investigation was over. The gathering phase was complete. What came next was execution. He printed the files, packed his equipment, and stared out the window as the night swallowed Willow Creek in silence. Somewhere beyond those pristine lawns and glowing windows lived the people who had destroyed his world, believing they were untouchable. But Ryan had lived in darkness before, and he was about to drag every last one of them into it. By the time winter surrendered to spring, Willow Creek had returned to its polished illusion of normalcy. Fresh mulch covered flower beds, driveways gleamed from weekly pressure washes, and the HOA's annual budget meeting was printed on glossy flyers taped to every front door. The charred remains of Ryan's house were now fenced off, an eyesore Karen described as unfortunate property neglect. But behind those manicured facades, a quiet war had begun. Ryan's months of investigation had given him a map, not of roads and fences, but of leverage. Every homeowner, every board member, every secret, all cataloged in his mind with surgical precision. He knew who had been coerced, who had been paid, and who was too afraid to speak. And slowly he began to turn them. His first move was subtle. A letter appeared in the mailboxes of every HOA board member, each with no return address. Inside, a printed copy of Karen's pre-fire insurance claim. No message, no threat, just the evidence. By dawn, the entire neighborhood buzzed with rumor. Some dismissed it as fake, others whispered about the possibility of arson. Karen tried to contain the panic, calling an emergency meeting and assuring everyone it was a smear campaign by a disgruntled resident. But her confidence faltered. Ryan could see it in the way her hands shook when she passed the gate, in the twitch of her jaw when she smiled. The fear was taking root. Ryan didn't stop there. He created anonymous social media accounts under the guise of concerned residents. Through posts and leaks, he began to expose the HOA's corruption, the bribes, the embezzlement, the fraudulent maintenance charges. Screenshots of forged documents appeared online, shared in local forums. He didn't need to lie, the truth was enough, and the truth spread faster than fire. Soon, homeowners began confronting the board. Dissent rippled through meetings once dominated by Karen's voice. People questioned the fines, the closed-door votes, the missing funds. The illusion of control she had built for years was cracking, and Ryan was there to widen every fracture. But Karen wasn't someone who surrendered power easily. Her retaliation came fast and calculated. Within days, Ryan received a legal notice accusing him of harassment, trespassing, and defamation. His property, still fenced, was cited for unsafe conditions, and a demolition notice appeared, signed by the HOA. It was a warning shot meant to remind him of who still held the paperwork, the city permits, the illusion of authority. Ryan almost smiled. He'd expected this. She was still playing by the rules of suburbia. He was. That night he slipped into the HOA office, not through the front door but through the ventilation duct he had mapped weeks before. The office was empty, dimly lit by the green glow of a security monitor. He moved like smoke, silent, methodical. On Robert Whitmore's computer he found what he was looking for: transaction records showing HOA funds being wired to shell accounts overseas, bribes disguised as landscape maintenance. He copied everything. But before he could leave, headlights flashed through the blinds. Karen's SUV. She entered the building alone, unaware of the shadow in the corner. Her phone was pressed to her ear, her voice sharp and strained. She was talking to Robert, something about tightening things and making sure he doesn't get to the board. Then, almost trembling, she said something that froze Ryan completely. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. She wasn't supposed to be home that night." Her words hung in the air like a confession whispered to the dark. Ryan's chest tight. Confirmation. Emily's death wasn't collateral, it was the result of arrogance, of a power trip gone too far, and she had just admitted it. He recorded every second. When she left, he slipped away undetected, carrying the final piece he needed. The mission had changed now. It wasn't about exposure anymore. It was about judgment. Over the next few days, the neighborhood began to fracture openly. Ryan leaked portions of Karen's confession anonymously to residents. At the same time, he sent evidence of the financial crimes to a local journalist known for exposing political scandals. The story spread like wildfire. Headlines began to appear. HOA corruption scandal unfolds in Willow Creek. The town that once bowed to Karen now whispered her name with disgust. But the exposure also made Ryan a target. Karen's allies, what few she had left, grew desperate. He noticed unfamiliar cars circling his apartment, received threatening notes under his door, even found his tires slashed one morning. It didn't shake him, it confirmed that he was winning. He countered every move strategically. The soldier in him resurfaced fully now, disciplined, ruthless, unflinching. He used decoys, false trails, and surveillance traps. He knew how to make predators expose themselves, and slowly they did. Robert made the first mistake. In a last-ditch effort to erase their tracks, he tried to delete files from his office computer, unaware Ryan had already cloned his drives. The local police, tipped off by Ryan's anonymous evidence drop, raided his office before dawn. The news broke hours later. Local fire inspector under investigation for fraud and tampering with evidence. Karen's empire was collapsing. Her board members resigned one by one, neighbors turned away from her, and reporters camped outside her home. Yet even cornered, she didn't stop fighting. She called a final HOA meeting, hoping to regain control, to spin the narrative, claiming she was the victim of a conspiracy. Ryan watched from the back of the room as she stood before her dwindling audience, her voice trembling between desperation and fury. She spoke of loyalty, of community, of protecting the neighborhood from dangerous people. But no one applauded this time, no one smiled. Then from the back someone shouted, "What about the fire?" Another voice followed, "We know what you did." The murmurs turned to chaos. Karen's face paled, her authority disintegrating before the very people she once ruled. Ryan didn't move, he didn't need to, the war was no longer hidden, it had spilled into the open and she was losing it in front of everyone. By nightfall, Karen's home was dark, reporters lined the street, police cruisers patrolled the cul-de-sac. Inside her once pristine living room, she sat alone, trembling, surrounded by half-packed boxes. Her phone buzzed constantly, reporters, lawyers, her husband, all demanding answers. Her empire of control had turned into a cage. And somewhere beyond the neighborhood's white fences, Ryan watched through binoculars from the hill overlooking Willow Creek. He wasn't celebrating, he wasn't smiling. The soldier in him never found satisfaction in destruction, only completion. But it wasn't over yet. The fire investigation was reopening, and Ryan knew corruption this deep didn't die quietly. There were still people protecting her, still strings to cut, still debts unpaid. As the rain began to fall, he whispered into the night, not to her, not to anyone else, but to the memory of Emily. "It's almost over." The rain didn't stop for days. It poured over Willow Creek like a cleansing flood, washing away the surface perfection, soaking through the manicured lawns, the painted fences, the polished driveways. It was as if the sky itself wanted to strip the neighborhood of its illusions, to reveal what truly rotted beneath. Karen Whitmore's empire had crumbled, but for Ryan the war wasn't finished. Justice had begun to stir, but it hadn't yet struck. There were still questions, loose ends that refused to die quietly. The fire that took Emily's life had been buried under paperwork and lies, and while the public saw corruption and scandal, Ryan saw something darker, a shadow that stretched beyond the HOA. In the weeks after the exposure, the state launched an official investigation into Willow Creek's HOA. The findings were devastating: fraud, misuse of funds, intimidation, coercion. Every word painted Karen as the villain she truly was. But amidst the reports and interviews, Ryan noticed something missing: the fire. It was still listed as accidental. Despite all the chaos, no one had yet connected Karen's insurance scam or Robert's role in tampering with the scene. He realized then someone was still protecting them. And Ryan knew exactly who. Chief Inspector Daniel Ray, Robert's longtime friend and superior officer at the local fire department. His signature was on nearly every report, every denied appeal, every conveniently lost file. He was the one who had closed the investigation before it ever began. The rot went higher than Ryan thought, so Ryan turned his focus to Ray. He began to track him, his routines, his patterns, his weaknesses. Ray was cautious but predictable, a man who thought power made him untouchable. He lived outside the neighborhood in a gated estate, funded far beyond what his salary could justify. Ryan knew corruption when he saw it, and this man reeked of it. Late one night, Ryan slipped into the darkened archives of the city's fire department. The air smelled of dust and cold metal. He moved with practiced silence, gloved hands gliding over rows of locked cabinets until he found the one labeled Closed Incidents Residential. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for: Case File 47B, Willow Creek Fire. Inside, the truth lay buried in plain sight. The original photos told a story. The report did not burn patterns consistent with accelerant melted residue near the porch, and an ignition point that matched the exact area where Karen's surveillance footage showed movement. Someone had deliberately rewritten the file, replacing the real findings with doctored pages. And at the bottom of the false report, in neat black ink, was Ray's signature. Ryan copied everything. The moment he stepped out of the archives, he wasn't just a victim seeking revenge, he was the carrier of truth, holding evidence powerful enough to dismantle the entire structure that had covered his wife's murder. But he didn't hand it to the police. Not yet. He knew how corruption worked. If Ray was willing to protect Karen, then others in the chain were too. One wrong move and the file would vanish again, this time permanently. So he did what he always did best: he planned his strike. He reached out to the journalist who had exposed the HOA scandal, sending fragments of the real fire report anonymously. The journalist's interest reignited instantly. Public pressure was already high, and a potential link between the HOA and the fire department promised headlines that could shake the city. Ryan knew that once the truth hit the public eye, no amount of influence could contain it. But before that could happen, Ray made his move. 2 days later, Ryan returned home to find his apartment door slightly ajar. Inside, drawers were overturned, files scattered, and his laptop smashed. Nothing of value was stolen, just destroyed. It was a message. Ray knew someone was digging. That night, as thunder cracked outside, Ryan sat by the window, staring at the reflection of his scarred knuckles against the glass. He'd fought wars in deserts, jungles, and oceans, but this war, this quiet suburban battlefield, was the most dangerous. Because here, the enemy wore badges, titles, and smiles. The next morning, the story broke. City fire inspector under investigation for evidence tampering in Willow Creek arson case. The journalist had run the files Ryan sent, every photo, every falsified page, every signature. The world now knew what Ryan had known all along: the fire was no accident. Public outrage erupted. The state sent investigators. The fire department went silent. Within 48 hours, Ray was suspended, and the police reopened the case as a criminal investigation. The same day, Robert Whitmore was taken into custody for fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Karen, once the queen of Willow Creek, was now the face of disgrace, cameras hounding her every step, neighbors crossing the street to avoid her gaze. Ryan watched it all unfold with a hollow calm. It wasn't triumph, it was inevitability. The truth, once buried in ash, was finally rising. But even as he watched their empire crumble, Ryan couldn't escape the ghosts. The image of Emily, her laughter in the morning light, her hands tracing the crib in their nursery, haunted every quiet moment. Justice could expose the guilty, but it couldn't bring her back. It couldn't erase the sound of sirens or the smell of smoke that still lingered in his dreams. He returned to the ruins of his old home for the first time since the fire. The blackened wood was cold now, brittle and lifeless. Weeds had begun to sprout between the cracks. He stood where the porch once stood, the same place the accelerant had been poured, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel everything he'd buried: rage, sorrow, and an ache that had no name. In his hand he carried Emily's wedding ring, the only thing the fire hadn't claimed. He placed it on the charred soil, whispering a promise that no one else would ever suffer what she had. As he turned to leave, a car pulled up. A city investigator stepped out, his face grim but respectful. He handed Ryan a sealed envelope, evidence confirmation, signed and dated. The fire was now officially classified as arson. It was over, at least on paper, but deep down Ryan knew there was still something unfinished. He had exposed the truth, dismantled the corrupt system, and destroyed the people who killed his wife. Yet the question remained: how could he live in the same world where justice had to be taken rather than given? That night, as the neighborhood sat in uneasy silence, a fire truck drove past for routine patrol, its lights flickering red across the wet asphalt. Ryan watched it fade into the distance, the rain still falling like tears from a sky that refused to clear. The past was burned, but its ashes clung to him. Every breath, every heartbeat carried the weight of it. And though the storm was ending, Ryan knew one thing with absolute certainty: peace wasn't something you found. It was something you fought for, again and again, until nothing was left standing between you and the truth. The sun rose over Willow Creek like an intruder, harsh, unwelcoming, and too bright for a neighborhood drowning in scandal. The manicured lawns were still trimmed, the mailboxes still polished, but beneath the surface everything had changed. The HOA that once dictated every blade of grass was now leaderless. News vans crowded the cul-de-sac, cameras pointed toward the house that had once been Karen Whitmore's throne. But inside those walls, the woman who had ruled through fear and control was falling apart. Karen hadn't slept in days. The endless ringing of her phone, the pounding on her door, the hateful messages flooding her inbox, all of it blurred into static. The world she had built from manipulation and arrogance was collapsing faster than she could deny it. Her husband, Robert, sat in county jail awaiting trial. Her name was plastered across every news feed, every headline, every whisper among neighbors who once obeyed her every word. She sat in her living room surrounded by half-empty wine bottles and crumpled legal papers. The house felt different now, hollow, stripped of its false perfection. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to mock her. She had spent years controlling others, enforcing rules and crushing opposition. But now the silence was louder than any victory she'd ever known. And she knew who was behind it all: Ryan, the quiet neighbor she once called unstable, the man she had underestimated, the man whose wife she'd burned out of existence. He had turned her world into ashes, not through violence but through truth. And that truth had done what no weapon ever could: it made her powerless. Outside, the neighborhood buzzed with curiosity. Some watched with pity, others with satisfaction. But Karen didn't care what they thought anymore. She was no longer fighting for reputation, she was fighting for survival. The court date loomed, and the prosecutors had evidence she couldn't explain away. Her insurance scam, her threats, her involvement in the fire, all documented, exposed. Still, she wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. In her twisted logic, she believed she could reclaim control. She called every contact she had: lawyers, board members, city officials, begging for help, promising favors, threatening exposure. But no one answered. One by one, her allies vanished into the same shadows she once ruled. And then came the letter. It arrived without a return address, just her name written neatly on the front. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single photo: the night of the fire. It showed her standing across the street, her face half lit by the flames, and beneath it a handwritten note. You said she was supposed to be home. Her breath caught. For the first time she felt genuine fear. Not the fear of losing status or comfort, but the primal kind, the kind that makes your blood run cold. Ryan wasn't just dismantling her life. He was closing in. That night, as thunder rolled across the sky, Karen sat by the window with a glass of wine and a pistol. Every shadow outside seemed alive. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the creak of the floorboards, sent her nerves spiraling. She kept checking the locks, packing the halls, whispering curses under her breath. Ryan was nowhere to be seen, but his presence filled the air. He didn't need to confront her directly. His silence was enough to drive her mad. Meanwhile, Ryan watched from a distance. He sat in his truck on the hill overlooking the neighborhood, the same vantage point he had used for weeks. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He was studying her descent, waiting for the right moment. Revenge for him was never chaos, it was calculation. He knew that fear was the one weapon Karen had never faced herself. She had spent her life wielding it but never enduring it. Now it consumed her. Every hour that passed was another crack in her armor. The next morning, police arrived at her doorstep with a warrant. The investigation into the HOA's financial crimes had expanded, and now her home was evidence. Officers entered, escorted by reporters who filmed her humiliation. Karen screamed at them, insisting it was all lies, that she was framed, but no one listened. Her empire was dust. Ryan watched it all from afar. It wasn't satisfaction that filled him, but a strange, hollow peace. For years he had been trained to neutralize threats, and now this was no different. Karen had been a different kind of enemy, but she was just as dangerous. Now she was finished. But fate, cruel as ever, wasn't done yet. That night Karen fled. She disappeared before the next court hearing, leaving her house in chaos, papers strewn everywhere, her car missing, her phone left behind. Authorities issued a warrant for her arrest, but she had vanished completely. For a moment Ryan considered that she might have finally accepted her fate, running from justice, from the life she had destroyed. But deep down he knew Karen better than that. She wasn't running away. She was hunting for an angle, and he was right. 2 nights later, as rain lashed against the highway, Ryan drove back toward the city after meeting with investigators. His headlights cut through the storm, and then for a split second he saw her. Standing in the middle of the road, soaked, eyes wild, clutching something in her hand. He slammed the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop just feet away. She didn't move. Her face was pale, her expression unhinged, a woman broken by her own delusions. In her hand was Emily's wedding ring. Ryan's pulse froze. How had she? Before he could move, she spoke, her voice shaking, distant. He couldn't hear her through the storm, but her lips formed the words clearly, "You ruined me." Then she stepped back into the path of an oncoming car. The impact was instant. The other vehicle swerved, screeched, and stopped 100 feet down the road. Ryan ran toward her, but it was too late. Karen lay motionless on the asphalt, the ring still in her palm, blood mixing with rainwater that ran down the street like dark rivers. She was gone. The woman who had destroyed his life, who had burned his world to ashes, had met an end of her own making. Not by his hand, but by her own choices, her own fear, her own unraveling. As the police and ambulance lights painted the night red and blue, Ryan stood over her lifeless body. For the first time in a long time, he felt something close to peace, not because she was dead, but because the fire she started had finally burned itself out. The story would spread quickly. The neighborhood would whisper again, spinning their theories, painting her as mad, tragic, evil, but Ryan didn't care. He knew the truth. Karen hadn't been defeated by vengeance. She had been consumed by it. And as the rain washed her blood from the road, Ryan closed his eyes, knowing that the final chapter was waiting, one not written in fire or revenge, but in reckoning. The rain had stopped, but Willow Creek was still drowning. Not in water, in silence. The kind that settles after a storm and refuses to leave. Karen Whitmore's death sent shockwaves through the town. Neighbors whispered, reporters swarmed, and investigators worked through the night, piecing together what remained of the chaos she left behind. But for Ryan, there was no satisfaction, no victory. Only the quiet aftermath of revenge fulfilled. He sat in his truck outside the sheriff's station, watching as officers loaded evidence boxes into vans. Inside those boxes lay the final remnants of Karen's empire. HOA ledgers, blackmail files, false invoices, and handwritten notes exposing years of manipulation. Her world, once pristine and untouchable, was officially closed, but something inside Ryan wouldn't let him rest. He had gotten justice, or at least the version of it that made sense to the world. Karen was gone, the HOA had been dissolved, his name cleared. But Emily's ring, the one Karen had clutched in her final moments, still burned like a brand in his pocket. It wasn't closure, it was a question. How had she gotten it? He'd buried that ring months ago at the base of the oak tree behind their home, the one Emily used to sit under when the pain from her illness became too much. He hadn't told anyone. Not a soul. The thought of Karen finding it meant she had been closer than he ever realized. Watching, waiting, and suddenly Ryan understood something chilling. Karen's story hadn't ended with her death. She had left a trail, one meant to outlive her. 2 days later, Ryan met with Detective Hayes, the lead investigator. Hayes was a grizzled veteran with the kind of stare that stripped lies to the bone. "She was obsessed," Hayes said, dropping a file on the table. "We found recordings, letters, even a map of your property. She'd been documenting you for months, tracking your routines, your family, your movements." Ryan didn't speak. He simply opened the file. Inside were photos taken from a distance, him on his porch, at the store, at the cemetery. Each picture was dated, labeled, and annotated in Karen's handwriting. She thought she could control the narrative even after everything she'd done, Hayes continued. She had a contingency plan, notes meant to frame you if she disappeared. But he sighed. "The recordings tell a different story. She confessed to everything." Ryan stared at the papers until the words blurred. The room felt small, suffocating. The truth was both a weapon and a wound. "She said you'd take everything from her," Hayes added quietly. "Looks like she was right." Ryan stood. "No," he said, his voice low. "She took everything from herself." Weeks passed. The neighborhood began to rebuild, fences repainted, lawns trimmed, mailboxes replaced, but the shine was gone. No HOA meetings, no rules, no Karen, just people living again, awkwardly free. Ryan tried to do the same. He visited Emily's grave every evening, sitting beside the stone in silence. Sometimes he talked to her, other times he just listened to the wind, the rustling leaves, the echoes of everything they'd lost. One evening he found a small envelope tucked against her gravestone. No name, no address. Inside was a folded note. She wasn't the only one. Ryan's stomach tight. Beneath the note was a photo, a man in a dark suit shaking Karen's hand in front of the HOA office. The caption read, City Contract Renewal 2022. He knew that face. It was Councilman Drew Langley, the same official who'd signed off on the HOA's community improvement grants, the ones that had funneled money into Karen's private accounts. The corruption ran deeper. Karen was just the face, the mask. Someone else had been pulling strings behind the scenes. Ryan folded the phone, pocketed it, and stood. The storm inside him reignited, not the reckless fire of vengeance, but something sharper, colder. The reckoning wasn't over, it was evolving. A week later, he drove into the city and parked across from the municipal building. Langley's car was already there, black Mercedes, tinted windows, vanity plates that screamed arrogance. Ryan waited, watching, remembering every detail of the man's smirk from HOA meetings, every dismissive glance, every signature that had enabled Karen's reign. He wasn't here for violence. He'd learned that vengeance didn't always require a weapon. Sometimes it just needed truth. Inside, he handed a flash drive to a journalist waiting in the lobby, one of the few who had covered Karen's story fairly. It's everything, Ryan said. Emails, financial records, property transfers. She didn't work alone. The reporter hesitated. And you're okay with this going public? Ryan's eyes were steady. It's time people saw what really happened. As he walked out, he felt something he hadn't in years, not relief, not peace, but purpose. By the time the evening news aired, the scandal had already broken wide open. Langley's name was everywhere, his face plastered across headlines alongside Karen's. The city launched an internal audit, arrests followed. For the first time since Emily's death, justice didn't feel hollow, it felt earned. That night, Ryan returned home, standing under the oak tree where everything had started and ended. He placed Emily's ring back into the earth, whispering, "It's over now." But as the wind rustled the leaves, he couldn't help but feel her presence, not haunting but proud. She had always believed in accountability, in doing the right thing no matter how painful. The reckoning wasn't vengeance, it was truth, and in truth he finally found peace. Ryan looked out across Willow Creek, the neighborhood reborn from ashes, and whispered to the night, "Rest easy, Em, the fire's out."